Getting ready for the market to open up. It's about 7:30. Hope you guys are having a great morning. So I did want to cover some topics for discussion. So you might excuse me, you might not hear about it just quite yet, but eventually what is going to happen is once a sufficient number of people get vaccinated, you're going to see more and more talk about climate change and the dangers moving forward. So this is kind of everything gets seeded a little early, right? Kind of like in the UK where they were talking about locking men down or having a curfew, right? Having a curfew for men. So a lot of times, a lot of these things are basically seeded to people to see how they react, right? That's why you're kind of hearing now of Biden talking about, bring back the mandates for the masks, right? Because things aren't going according to plan. And when things don't start to go according to plan, the government gets a little bit tighter. Now, of course, the government can't sit here and basically squeeze and squeeze and squeeze and squeeze, because eventually what happens is the people will revolt. For a lot of people who think that other countries are just kind of going along with the narrative, they're not. If you look on any other sort of like international news outlet, you'll see that there are riots and protests basically going on across the globe. Like, for example, the people in Myanmar are literally fighting with sticks and slingshots and rocks against the military that are shooting at them with guns. And it's just kind of sad in America where I think Americans have like 46% of all the guns that exist in the world, and yet not a single one of them is willing to do anything to fight for their freedom. And you have people in other countries that are literally getting hosed down, like, for example, in Germany and in France, where they bring out the hoses and they basically, in the cold, are spraying all these people down with water who are protesting against the lockdowns, very similarly in the UK. But in America, people just like, do I get a stimmy check? What? Vaccine? What? Sure, no, why not? And so moving forward, like once all is said and done, what is going to happen, right? So the concept is to perpetually, of course, keep individuals in the West in a sort of semi-perpetual lockdown. There was a recent article, I read it a couple of days ago and I can't seem to re-find it. And I believe it came out of either Morgan Stanley or Goldman Sachs, where they had came up with an article talking about how Americans need to perpetually get used to being in pandemic-like conditions. And what they were referring to in that article, hopefully I'll be able to find it by the time I put this video out, which is that moving forward, like, Americans should be getting used to basically perpetual lockdowns moving forward, despite getting vaccinated. Which is why even when people get vaccinated, they still have to wear gloves, you still have to social distance, you still have to wear a mask, etc. Right? Even when everybody moving forward. And this is, just to kind of soften people up. They're not going to just go out there and tell you what the agenda is or explain it to you in any sort of detail. They're just basically slowly boiling the country. Once things get a little too hot, then they simmer it down. Right? Once things get a little too hot, then they simmer it down. That's why from 15 days to slow the spread to vaccine passports. And I told you in my last video, pay attention to what is going on in Israel. In Israel, where they instituted basically like tracking devices for individuals who had tested positive. And so instead of having these people in their hotels, they basically were tracking them in their homes. And there was another article, or I should say another video, linked within that video that I highly recommend anybody to watch, talking more in-depthly from the standpoint of an Israeli woman who was basically an activist against the lockdowns, basically fighting for freedom. And so Israel, like I talked about in a completely separate video about how Pfizer had basically given them the vaccines for free in exchange for some good data. And of course, everybody now is referencing, a lot of people reference the information coming out of Israel. And of course, this is all planned information. I've highly talked about overwhelmingly, whenever you look at the statistics, even that came out of, I believe it was the UK, where overwhelmingly the vast majority of people who had passed away were typically older people, older than 60, with comorbidities, and that those who were not elderly or who did not have comorbidities were far and few between. But in any event, moving forward, what's going to happen is they're going to start trying to do what are called carbon lockdowns, right? So as carbon, rates start to rise, they're going to institute lockdowns. And people might think this doesn't make any sense. Why would they do this? And more than likely, obviously, it is for control. But the West is collapsing. Most Western countries are financially collapsing. And so what they're basically trying to institute is more of a feudalistic sort of system. And that's why you're seeing individuals, of course, like Bill Gates, basically buying up huge amounts of land. And in my opinion, it's because the West can't compete with China. They basically have abdicated the throne, which is why you don't even see really America pushing back against China. Yeah, sure, they put a little bit of sanctions here and there, but you quickly saw how trade can be basically halted when necessary, right? So China has no problems with making other deals with other countries, but in essence, moving forward, this is what many Americans have to look forward to, which is why I recommend, if you're a single man with a skill, I wholeheartedly recommend that you consider getting out of the country before it is too late. Eventually, they will make it very difficult for individuals to fly. They may allow you to do maybe some interstate flying, but they may not let people out of the country. And that's just kind of what happens when the lockdowns come. The other thing you have to keep into consideration is whether other countries will accept you moving forward, right? And so you see individuals like this, like Mr. Gates, talking about climate change could be more devastating than C-19, and this is what the US must do to prepare. And so there are going to be more and more articles talking about this individual and, of course, climate change. Of course, this is all nonsense. Overwhelmingly, China and India are responsible for carbon emissions. China produces 50% of all the coal coming out into the market. Even though they talk about moving into EV spaces, etc., it's just all a ploy. It's just all a scam. Just basically a scam. China has no intention of lowering their EV emissions. It's just not going to happen. China is the #1 producer in the world, and they're not going to do in 2008 when the economy collapsed. China, in essence, was basically when China became #1. During that time period, China was the #1 producer, and during that time period, they basically started spending money hand over fist and became the number one producer. That was basically when America fell. Everything moving forward was just basically patchwork, stimulus after stimulus, QE after QE. And what we're seeing now is the inevitable collapse, which is why you see the Capitol being guarded so heavily. It's because they know what they've done. They know what they've done, and they know what eventually is going to happen, which is the collapse of the West. They've printed themselves into so much debt that the collapse becomes inevitable. It's just a reality. It's happened year over year in different countries, and America eventually will be next. America eventually will be next when the dollar loses enough value. There are already news articles warning Americans about don't be surprised if the dollar holds a little bit less and less value moving forward. And of course, you have another another package coming out by Joe Biden for another $3 trillion for infrastructure. I highly doubt that there's going to be any infrastructure changes, but I do imagine that a lot of this money is going to go into the hands of corporations, which is what we saw previously, right? You saw things going into companies like, for example, Moderna. Moderna has never brought a drug to market, right? Moderna is a company that came out of the woodwork, and this company has never released a medication. The very first medication that they released was a brand new vaccine for a brand new disease, right? When you look at companies, for example, like Pfizer, right? Pfizer also very similarly also released a drug, Johnson & Johnson, but you do not see the type of movement that you do in their stocks. Same thing with, for example, with AstraZeneca, right? So all of these companies have released medications or released vaccines, but you see no movement within the stocks. But then when you look at Moderna, you can see basically the company went from about a $20 company all the way up to $185. It went up 810% within a little over a year. And it's because this company was picked to be where all the money was going to go. This is where a lot of the money went for that program, for the, what is it called, the Warp Speed program. This is where it went. It wasn't because Moderna was this amazing biotech company and, you know, they do fantastic work. They've come out with so many different drugs. They were just literally picked. They were literally picked, which is why when you look at other companies like Pfizer and other these companies, there's literally no movement. There's no movement in the stock. And wouldn't you think that there would be movement in the stock where literally the whole world requires the use of these vaccines, but yet you don't see anywhere near the type of movement that you do, for example, from companies like this, because this company came out of the woodwork. And I had released numerous videos talking about how people were worried. They didn't, like, who is Moderna? They don't even have a reputable CEO. There was news articles talking about who the hell is this CEO? Like, nobody knows who he is. He's a nobody CEO, but yet they were the ones that were picked. And ironically, you have the black CEO from Merck, who I talked about in another video, that basically said there's no way that they're going to be able to come out with a vaccine in time, because vaccines take years. It takes like a decade for a reputable vaccine to come out, and then within that year he ended up having to resign. And it's one of the reasons why there was several articles talking about how you can mix and match the different vaccines. If you got the jab for this company, it didn't matter because you could take the jab from this one and that one and that one, etc. And it's because it's all the same shit. It's all the same shit. It's just this is the one that got picked where the money was going to go, and the other ones, of course, didn't. It's just a reality. If you don't follow anything in the financial markets, what was that movie with McGuire, right? Show Me the Money. And that's when in doubt, follow the money. When in doubt, follow the money, and it lets you know what the agenda is. And that's why I said in my last video that moving forward, that this disease, right? This disease is way too lucrative, and that they're not going to let it go. Even though, regardless of, you can show them statistics till you're blue in the face, it doesn't matter. They're going to keep moving forward with the agenda, and the agenda is just feudalism. That's all it is. At the end of the day, it just boils down to a feudalistic sort of system, which is why you see them letting in all of these Hispanics into the countries, because they need more. In essence, they need more slaves. Just a reality, right? From one Hispanic to another. I see it. It's funny. I just went out this morning to get some breakfast, and like I said, the people here that have all the shops that are set up on the street, the workers, the doormen, they're all Hispanic. Even though I live, it's predominantly white upper class neighborhood here in Manhattan. And when I talk to my fellow Hispanics, they all see it. I was talking to the lady. I was like, you see, they're coming out with the passport. I was like, it's all communism. And a Hispanic guy just walking up, he's sitting there nodding his head. They already know this. They already know this because this is where they come from. They see it coming a mile away. But Americans are going to learn the hard way.